everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. Today we're going to conclude our discussion of the terms derived from verbs. So we've already talked about the active participle, ism al-fa'il, and about the masdar. And the third and last of these concepts is the passive participle, ism al-maf'ul. The reason I've been emphasizing these concepts so much is because honestly, once you've mastered them, you've literally multiplied your whole Arabic vocabulary by 3. Because from any verb you already know, you'll immediately know or at least be able to derive 3 additional words with lots of extremely important uses. So the reason I've left the passive participle for last, even though in a way it's the easiest of these concepts to grasp, is because it's part of a broader conversation about the passive voice in Arabic, or at least in Palestinian Arabic. So let's jump in and you'll quickly see what I mean. So I mentioned already that the active participle is the opposite of the active participle, which is the state of a subject carrying out an ongoing action. So the passive participle is the state of a subject upon which an action is carried out. So an active participle like fahim, which comes from the verb fihim, meaning to understand, refers to someone who is understanding, so to speak, whereas the passive participle of the same verb is mafhum, meaning understood. I think the passive participle is more intuitive for English speakers because the active participle doesn't always translate into English perfectly. So for example, we say in English, I understand, rather than I'm understanding, even though in Arabic it's much more common to say ana fahim, rather than to use the simple present bafham, whereas the passive participle pretty much always translates quite neatly into English, and it's used in pretty much the exact same way. So at this point, I could ask you, for example, mafhum, right? So I'm asking you understood. Now, before I give you some more examples, let's talk about how it's formed. So once again, the name of the term, ism al-maf'ul, gives you the pattern, right? So first you start with a meme with a fatha. So it's ma. And then the main characteristic feature of the pattern is that after the second letter of the root, so in this case, in the case of fihim, it would be the ha. There's this like long oo sound that's represented by a waw. And of course the first and last letters just have sukun, so no vowel sound. And that's why it's mafhum, right? So that waw is critical, and it's really the dead giveaway that you're looking at a passive participle. Because again, remember that these patterns are super fixed, so it's really always going to be pronounced that way when you see it. So that's the awesome thing about Arabic patterns, and again, it's why you really shouldn't be afraid of the fact that Arabic doesn't have written vowels, because when there's a pattern like this, it automatically tells you how it's pronounced. So let's take a look at some other examples. So from fihim you get mafhum, understood, but what about the verb arif, meaning to know? Well, you start with the ma, right? And then the ra leads into a waw that ends with the fa, which takes no vowel. So it's ma'ruf, and it means known. So again, the translation into English is super straightforward for these terms. So take a look at the verb, for example, katab, meaning to write. So as you can imagine, the word that we're looking for would be written, and it's maktub. So you have mafhum, ma'aruf, maktub. You can really start to feel the pattern just based on how they sort of rhyme, right? By the way, at the end of the video, I always use this word. Al-maw'a tabai maktub taht bil description. So my website is written down below in the description. Now, what would it mean if I said maftuh? Well, first you find the root, right? So take out the meme and the waw, and then you get the root and the verb fatah, which means to open. So maftuh means opened, or at least open, right? Whichever you prefer. So you might call a restaurant, for example, and ask al-mat'am maftuh, and that would mean like, is the restaurant open? Now I'm going to give you 2 new verbs that are really useful and try to derive the active participles and guess what they mean. So first you have samah. So again, that's samah, and it means to allow. And it's where you get the expression law samaht. Law means if, and of course samaht is the past tense, in this case referring to you, anta. So law samaht literally means if you allow, and it's just a way to say please. So biddi ahwa law samaht is I'd like a coffee, please. Have you figured out what the passive participle would be? Well, it would be masmouh, and the meaning is simply allowed, right? So for example, at-tadkhin mish masmouh jwa al-mahal. So smoking is not allowed inside the establishment. As a matter of fact, tadkhin is the masdar of the form 2 verb dakhan, meaning to smoke, hence smoking. If you watch my video on the masdar, you'll notice it sounds like ta'lim. So ta'lim, tadkhin, etc. Ta'lim also coming from a form 2 verb, allam, meaning to teach. So ta'lim can mean teaching or education. Anyway, I'm not trying to change the topic, it's just to show you how everything relates and how these concepts keep coming up and will keep coming up as we go along. Now, the opposite of samah, to allow, is mana, meaning to forbid. So the passive participle for this one is maybe even more common than masmuh. Can you derive it? It would be mamnu', right? Mamnu', which of course means forbidden. Now, I feel like forbidden is kind of a formal word in English, but in Arabic it's very common. You're actually more likely to see, for example, mamnu' at-tadkhin juwa al-mahal. Smoking inside the establishment is forbidden. But even in speech, it's pretty common to say, for example, mamnu' taqta' al-ma'bar bidun tasrih. So even though mamnu' means forbidden in English, the more natural translation really would be you're not allowed to cross the checkpoint without a permit. So just because in English it just sounds like very severe to say it's forbidden to blah blah blah. But obviously the fundamental meaning is the same. I also want to point out to you that to say you're not allowed to blah blah blah, you use the subjunctive, which we've also talked about. It's the present tense without the ba, used to indicate like a hypothetical or somehow unreal action. Just as in English you say you're not allowed to cross, in Arabic it's mamnu' taqta'. So the you enter conjugation of the verb qata', which in Ammiya means to cross. So for example, qata' ash-shara' means he crossed the street. So anyway, to review, we have mafhum, ma'ruf, maktub, maftuh, masmuh, and mamnu'. So hopefully the pattern is very clear to you at this point because you'll continue to see it like all the time. Okay, lastly I want to make a really quick point that is very important, but it's good news. Basically, I'm telling you there's something that you don't need to know or worry about at all. So maybe you're familiar with a concept known as the passive voice, which is the opposite of the active voice. Now, this exists in every language, by the way. Basically, the active voice is when the subject of the sentence is doing the main action of the sentence, which is like the broad majority of all sentences. So for example, I ate, I know, he writes, she swam, etc. So the passive voice is when the subject is the object of an action instead, such as I was seen. I didn't see, someone else saw me. The was, by the way, is the dead giveaway of the passive voice, as in he was hit by a car, let's say. I'm talking about him, but he didn't really do anything. Rather, the car hit him. And actually, the car hit him is the active voice version of the same sentence, because now the subject of the sentence, the car, is doing the main action of the sentence. So he was hit, he was seen, he was blah blah blah. Those are all passive voice sentences. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because there's something that tripped me up in the beginning, which was, how do I say sentences like that in Arabic? So actually the point I want to make, first of all, is that you basically never phrase sentences like that in Palestinian Arabic. And I'm pretty sure this is true of all Arabic dialects, but I don't speak other Arabic dialects, so take that with a grain of salt. But in any case, if you did try to speak like in the passive voice, you would just end up sounding super fusha. And the reason I'm saying this now is because a sentence like ar-ratib maktub, meaning the link, like the link to a website, is written down. This is in a way a passive voice sentence using the passive participle. So you might be left wondering, well, now that I've learned the passive participle, I still don't really get how I would say like he was hit by a car, right? Would I use the passive participle or something like that? Well, not at all. In fact, that sentence just literally would not be said like that in Arabic to begin with. Instead, you would actually say in the active voice. So you would say صدمة سيارة, which literally means a car hit him, right? So you just wouldn't say he was hit. The subject switches to the car, and that's why you end up saying the car hit him. And again, it's not that you can't phrase the sentence in the passive voice, it's just that if you were to do that using the technical way of doing that in Fusha, well, you would just sound super Fusha and not very natural. In fact, even if you wanted to emphasize the him as the main topic of the sentence, which is the whole point of saying, he was hit by a car in English, it's to emphasize him, right? You would actually just start the sentence with huwa, so it's almost like you start talking about huwa, but then you just revert to talking about the car. So you would actually say, huwa sadmatu sayyara. He, a car hit him, right? Do you see what I mean? You just entirely avoid the passive voice altogether. Another example, my name was taken off the list. would be rephrased as they, a sort of general undefined they, took my name off the list. So it would be طلعوا, they took out, طلعوا اسمي من القائمة. So to summarize, I've given you the passive participle, like understood, open, etc. But these basically work like adjectives. And instead, if you actually wanted to make a passive voice sentence, like my name was written down on the list, you would just rephrase it in the active voice. So كتبوا اسمي بالقائمة, they wrote my name on the list. And if you didn't rephrase it, you would just sound formal, but not even in a polite way. I mean, it would just sound like robotic, I would say. So yeah, I know that last part was very grammatical, but the fundamental point of the video is that you understand the passive participle, which I think is very straightforward. And the moral of the story with the passive voice stuff is just don't overthink it. Make your life easier by phrasing the sentence in the simplest possible way. Anyway, as always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And now that we've finally covered the active and passive participles plus the masdar, we're 100% ready to go to learn the remaining verb forms. And trust me, you will see how easy it gets from there. So yeah, see you next time.
اهلا حبايبي، شكرا للجماعة اللي بيحضروا القناة. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضية بالبلاي ليست. وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعليم اللهجة الفلسطينية، بتقدروا تلاقوه بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالدسكريبشن. وبشوفكم المرة الجاية.